Allah Almighty gave this great glad tidings to promised Messiah alayhi salam, that I shall cause thy message to reach the corners of the earth. It is not only today when Ahmadis all over the world witness the fulfillment of this great glad tidings, but Allah Almighty also showed signs of this fulfillment to the promised Messiah alayhi salam. The message of the promised Messiah alayhi salam had reached to all continents in his lifetime, including Australia. Therefore, history of Ahmadiyyat in Australia is spanned over 100 years. Australia is the smallest continent and the biggest island on Earth, situated in the southern hemisphere. It is the world's sixth largest country by total area. Its neighbouring countries include Indonesia, East Timor, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia to the north, and New Zealand to the southeast. It is estimated that this land has been inhabited for at least 40,000 years by indigenous Australians, who are called Aborigines. These people were thought to have arrived here by boat from Southeast Asia. These indigenous Australians remain isolated from the rest of the world for thousands of years and remain confined within their own specific culture and traditions. After discovery by Dutch explorers in 1606, a number of European explorers sailed the coast of Australia, then known as New Holland, in the 17th century. However, it wasn't until 1770 that Captain James Cook charted the east coast and claimed it for Britain. The new outpost was called New South Wales and put to use as a penal colony, and on the 26th of January 1788, the first fleet of 11 ships carrying 1,500 people, half of them convicts, arrived in Sydney Harbour. The population grew steadily in subsequent decades. The continent was explored and an additional 5 self-governing crown colonies were established. On 1st January 1901, Australia's 6 states and 2 territories became a nation under a single constitution, forming the Commonwealth of Australia. Today, Australia is home to people from more than 200 countries, and its population is almost 23 million. Arrival of Muslims to Australia predates European settlement and has been traced far back as the 16th and 17th centuries. During that time, Indonesians known as Makassans used to visit Australian shores regularly and share their lives with local indigenous people throughout northern Australia through trade, ceremony and marriage. But apparently, they did not make a broader impact on Australian society. Therefore, Afghan Muslim Kamalis who came here in the 19th century are regarded as the founders of Islam in Australia. During the 1850s, when it was decided to explore Central Australia, horses and other animals were used to cross the country. However, the harsh and barren Australian land proved too much a challenge for them. In 1860, the government of the day decided to introduce camels and men who can handle them in order to link inland Australia. Therefore, in June 1860, the first 3 Afghans with 24 camels arrived in Melbourne to participate in Burke and Will's expedition.
Thomas Elder and his partner Samuel Stuckey, who were pastoralists in Australia, South Australia, decided that they would send a little expedition to India, pick up some camels and come back. And on this trip he was able to load up a ship with camels, and he brought back camel handlers, and they brought in approximately 25 camel handlers, I think. We don't know their names. Some of their names then appear here and there, but essentially we know that they were recruited in and around Karachi. And probably the Sindh area. Yeah.
That was the start. And then, in the next 5 decades, more than 2,000 Muslim Kamalis and thousands of camels arrived in Australia. These Kamalis and their animals made a significant contribution in discovering inland Australia. These Kamalis opened up the outback, helped with the construction of the overland telegraph line and railways, erected fences, acted as guides for several major expeditions, and supplied almost every inland mine or station with its goods and services. These pilots of the desert made a vital contribution to Australia. One of the famous Afghan achievements in Australia is the train link of Port Augusta and Alice Springs, known as the Ghan Rail Link. After the completion of the railway in 1889, the South Australian government, in appreciation of Afghan workers, gave it the name Afghan Express or Rail Afghan. Today this rail link is famous by the name Ghan Express, short for Afghans. These Afghans used to live on the outskirts of major towns. Therefore these areas used to be called as Ghan towns.
And they were living there in a sort of rudimentary accommodation, shanty town, I think you'd call it. And people, some of them probably owned the blocks that they were maybe beginning to build houses on, but a number of them were living in sort of dormitory accommodation, I guess. And they, or in tents, and they'd set off and they'd come back, and a lot of the time they'd be on the road.
Islam played an important part in their lives of Afghans in Australia. Almost everywhere they went, they constructed mosques, small or great. The first mosque was built in 1861 in Maree. Later on, they built larger mosques in Adelaide in 1888, in Perth in 1905, and in Brisbane in 1908. One of these Afghans, Muhammad Hassan Musa Khan Sahab, is the historical figure who accepted Ahmadiyyat in 1903 and was the first Ahmadi of Australia. Hassan Musa Khan Sahab was an educated Afghan who had studied in universities of Sindh and Bombay. He was an expert in 5 Oriental languages. In Australian literatures, Hassan Musa Khan Sahab has been mentioned as well-educated or high-educated Indian. Indeed, Hassan Musa Khan Sahab was one of the leaders of the Muslims in Australia. An authority of this subject, the writer of the book Tim Mosques and Ghan Towns writes, he became spokesperson for the Western Australian Afghans, indeed at times for all the Afghans in Australia.
Actually, he was conscious of what you could call the diaspora of Islam in countries that were not predominantly Islamic. And I believe he was connected to a network of other similarly well-educated Muslims through the world. Through the world, I think. So he really is a most fascinating fellow, and he ran a news agency in Perth.
In 1904, Muslims of Western Australia bought a land in Perth to build a mosque. Hazrat Sufi Hassan Musa Khan Sahab was the foundation member and was the first secretary of the mosque, and he served in that capacity for many years.
It is interesting that Hassan Musa Khan, who wrote the book, which is the sort of account of how the Perth Mosque was built and who subscribed to it, and he was one of the key people to raise money for that he documented the sort of tribal affiliation of all those who were contributing money. Yeah, I think he was a tremendous figure. And,
he must have been.
And 1903 is the period when he's writing a lot of those letters to the newspaper.
Yeah.
So he's really become socially aware and active.
Hazrat Sufi Hazrat Musa Khan Sahib Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu had 2 brothers, and both of them were the companions of the promised Messiah Alayhi Salam. And it was through them that Hazrat Hassan Musa Khan Sahib came to know about the promised Messiah Alayhi Salam. And in September 1903, he wrote his letter of Bai'at to promised Messiah Alayhi Salam. Replying to that letter, on behalf of the promised Messiah Alayhi Salam, Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Karim Sahib Sialkoti Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu wrote to Hazrat Hassan Musa Khan Sahib that his Bai'at has been accepted by the promised Messiah Alayhi Salam, and that letter is dated 3rd of October 1903.
During the 5th Khalifa's visit to Australia, in his Friday sermon of the 14th of April 2006, His Holiness talked about Hassan Musa Khan Sahib and said,
जो आप लोगों की दिलचस्पी के लिए मैं बात बताने लगा हूँ वो ये है कि यहाँ की जो तारीख़ मुरतब हुई है उसके मुताबिक हज़रत सूफ़ी साहब को ये एज़ाज़ भी हासिल है कि आप बैरून हिंदुस्तान निज़ाम वसीयत में शामिल होने वाले अवलीन मूसी हैं और हज़रत मसीह अलैहिस्सलाम ने जब ऐलान फरमाया वसीयत का तो उसके 3 महीने के बाद ही तकरीबन उन्होंने वसीयत कर दी थी और इस तरह आपकी वसीयत मार्च 1906 की है।
Hazrat Sufi Hasan Musa Khan Sahib Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu went back to India in 1912, and actually he wanted to stay there. But during his stay he sought advice from Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Awwal Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu, who told him, you go back to Australia and it is better for you. So as per advice of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Awwal Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu, Hazrat Sufi Sahib came back and he never returned back to India. He served here in Australia almost 30 years as honorary missionary of Jamaat Ahmadiyya, and he died here on 18th of August 1945 and was buried in Karkata Cemetery in Perth.
The year 1903 is important in the history of Ahmadiyyat in Australia because that year an Australian-born met the promised Messiah alayhi salam in Qadian. His name was Mr. Charles Francis Sebright, who was born in Melbourne in 1862 as a Catholic. He converted to Islam in 1896 and changed his name to Muhammad Abdul Haq. Mr. Sebright travelled to India in 1903 as a representative of the British and Empire League of Australia.
Muhammad Abdul Haq Sahib was the representative of British and Indian Empire League, and as a representative of that league he went to India in 1903 to attend a conference of the Congress in Madras later that year. And actually it was this visit to India when he met promised Messiah alayhi salam. In October he was in Lahore where he delivered a lecture, and after that lecture he was approached by 2 Ahmadis, Mian Mirajuddin Umar Sahib and Hakim Nur Muhammad Sahib, and both of those Ahmadis invited him to visit Qadian and actually meet the promised Messiah alayhi salam. So on 22nd of October 1903 Muhammad Abdul Haq Sahib was in Qadian and he stayed there for a couple of days. He attended the dars of Hazrat Hakim Maulvi Nuruddin Sahib Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu, and also he had the privilege to meet promised Messiah alayhi salam and ask questions. He stayed there for 2 days and then left. At that time he did not accept the Ahmadiyyat, and actually it was almost 2.5 years after, in early 1906, when he was in New Zealand, he made that announcement through an article that appeared in April 1906 Review of Religion, and since then he was an Ahmadi, and but shortly after that announcement he moved from New Zealand to USA and spent rest of his life there.
Mr. Charles Sebright, also known as Mr. Abdul Haq, wrote an article that was published in the Muslim Sunrise in October 1922, in which he mentioned his conversion to Islam, travel to India, meeting with the promised Messiah alayhi salam, as well as he reiterating his connection with Jamaat Ahmadiyya. He writes, "This meeting with Ghulam Ahmad in Qadian in the year 1903 was a wonderful proof of the truths of Islam, that words which had been uttered 1300 years ago were then being fulfilled. Nothing astonished me more among all the extraordinary incidents during my missionary travels than the finding of myself in that sacred place and face to face with its Messiah. Eventually, when I was presented to him and eyes looked into eyes, he knew me to Abdul Haq, and I knew him to be the divinely appointed one, to call the true believers together again, to make the world safe for Islam. After the advent in America of Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, I have further fulfilled my pledge to associate with the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam." Yet another prominent Ahmadi and companion of the promised Messiah alayhi salam in Australia was Professor Clement Raig. Professor Raig was a renowned astronomer of his time. He was born in England but spent most of his professional life in Australia. He was a founding member of the Royal Meteorological Society of Australia. He is also credited to give names to cyclones, a practice that is used till today.
In 1908, Professor Clement Raig was visiting India as part of his world tour, and during that time he delivered many lectures on astronomy. In May 1908, he stayed for a very short period of time in Lahore. There he delivered a lecture, And after that lecture, Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib Razillah Ta'ala Anhu approached him and told him about the claims of the promised Messiah alayhi salam. He was very much surprised and expressed his desire to meet promised Messiah alayhi salam in person. And the meeting was arranged, and he came to meet promised Messiah alayhi salam on 12th of May 1908 after Zuhr prayer. And after the first meeting, after a few days, he again approached Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq Sahib and requested if he can meet the promised Messiah alayhi salam again. He was very lucky enough to get that permission, and he met promised Messiah alayhi salam again on 18th of May 1908, just 8 days before the promised Messiah alayhi salam passed away.
Professor Clement Reig spent later part of his life in New Zealand and died there in 1922. During his tour to New Zealand in 2006, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih V, may Allah strengthen his hands, met the grandchildren of Professor Clement Reig and also visited his grave and prayed there.
There were many other Ahmadis who came at the start of the 20th century to Australia, and among them in Queensland it was Ali Bahadur Khan Sahib, in New South Wales it was Shadi Khan Sahib, and the first Ahmadi of Adelaide was Muhammad Alam Kandhari Sahib. All of these Ahmadis remained here in Australia for almost half a century, probably without the knowledge of each other's existence. But even after living such a long period of time here in Australia, they kept their faith in the promised Messiah alayhi salam. And when they died, they left the mark of their faith on their graves.
Apart from these early Ahmadis, there were Ahmadis who came to Australia in the 40s, 50s and 60s for business or education purposes, but none of them stayed here permanently. Hazrat Chaudhry Muhammad Zafrullah Khan Sahib also visited Australia in 1965 and met Governor General Lord Casey and Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies. A new phase in history of Ahmadiyyat in Australia dawned in the 1970s when Dr. Ijazul Haq, former Vice Principal of Lahore Dental College, and Rana Muhammad Amjad Khan Sahib from Pakistan, and Mr. Shamsuddin Khan and his family from Fiji migrated to Australia. These Ahmadis and a few others started to meet regularly, and Alhamdulillah by middle of 1979, Jamaat was properly established with the permission of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih III. In his address on day 2 of Jalsa Salana 1979 in Rabwa, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih III Rahmatullah Alayh said, "New Jamaat has been established in Australia."
हुजूर जब 82 में यूरोप की दौरे पे तशरीफ़ ले गए थे और खुशकिस्मती से मैं भी उस काफ़िला का एक अदना सा मेंबर था, तो हुजूर की ख्वाहिश ये थी कि अब मशरिक़ की तरफ हम जाएं, और चूँकि हज़रत खलीफतुल मसीह सालिस रहमहुल्लाह की ये ख्वाहिश थी कि यहाँ जमात इस तरह कायम हुआ और जमात इस तरह से कायम हुआ.
After the approval of Khalifatul Masih IV Rahmatullah Alayh, a land of 28 acres was bought in Marsden Park, and it was on the blessed day of 30th September 1983 when Hazrat Khalifatul Masih IV Rahmatullah Alayh himself laid the foundation stone of Al-Masjid Baitul Huda, followed by the companion of the promised Messiah alayhi salam, Hazrat Maulvi Muhammad Hussain Sahab Raziyallahu Anhu. The ceremony of laying the foundation stone of Baitul Huda was widely published in Australia and abroad. During his tour, Hazur gave interviews to local, state and national media, delivered lectures at Riverston School, National University of Canberra, and attended receptions given in his honour. The tour of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih IV proved to be a remarkable turning point in the history of Ahmadiyyat in Australia. Jamaat was more organised and focused. In 1984, Jamaat Ahmadiyya Australia held its first Jalsa Salana when only 80 people attended. With that humble beginning, Jalsa Salana has become an international Jalsa in which thousands of Ahmadis from different parts of Australia and neighbouring countries attend. The first Emir and missionary in charge of Australia, Mr. Shakil Ahmed Munir Sahab, came to Australia in 1985. And in the same year, for the first time, the magazine of Jamaat Ahmadiyya Australia Al-Huda was published. During the centenary year in 1989, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih IV visited Australia again to inaugurate Batul Huda Mosque. It was Friday and it was Eid al-Adha. After Eid and Friday prayers in the afternoon of the 14th of July 1989, Hazur officially inaugurated Batul Huda Mosque, the first Ahmadi mosque in Australia. On 17th July 1991, Mahmood Ahmad Shahid Saab came to Australia and assumed his responsibilities as Emir and missionary in charge Australia. At that time, there were only a few Ahmadis in Australia. As per guidance of Hazrat Khalifat al-Masih IV, Mahmood Ahmad Shahid Saab informed the officials about plight of Ahmadis in Pakistan.
तो फिर वो लिखने लगे हम लोग, तो कहा कि उन्होंने तो 4-5 लिखा था, हम लोग 8-10 लिखे। मैंने कहा नहीं 8-10 नहीं, कम से कम 40 तो लिखना चाहिए, 40 के मुँह का एक जमात बनता है, तो लिख देंगे, काट देंगे। फिर जब दरख्वास्त किया तो उसकी रिजल्ट जो है ना वो हैरान कन थे। उन्होंने कहा 50 बंदे आएंगे तुम्हारे। तो हुजूर बड़ा खुश हुए। हुजूर ने फरमाया कि मैं चॉइस करूँगा कुछ किसने आना है। तो पहले 3 ग्रुप हुजूर ने इस तरह चॉइस किया। तो पहला ग्रुप सिडनी में आए, दूसरा ग्रुप आए उधर ब्रिस्बेन, तीसरा आपके मेलबर्न में आए, उसके बाद फिर एडिलेड।
2006 is that blessed year where once again the Khalifat al-Masih blessed Australian soil with his arrival. Hazrat Khalifat al-Masih V, may Allah strengthen his hands, attended the 22nd Jalsa Salana Australia. Subsequently, he visited Brisbane, Adelaide and Canberra Jamaats. He also laid the foundation stone for Khilafat Centenary Hall. In October 2006, Jamaat Ahmadiyya Victoria bought a huge facility that will be served as a place of worship, mission house and a community centre. In that place, which is now officially called Ahmadiyya Centre, Melbourne, up to 2,000 people can offer prayers at one time. It also has guest rooms, offices and library. In Brisbane, Jamaat had purchased a land and a small namaz centre was built on it. Now, after approval from Council, Jamaat is building the second purpose-built mosque of Australia. And Hazur, may Allah strengthen his hand, will inaugurate that mosque during his visit to Australia in 2013, inshallah. While in Adelaide, Jamaat has also purchased a land to build a mosque and a mission house. In the last 20 years, Jamaat Ahmadiyya Australia has progressed remarkably. Even still a small organisation, Jamaat Ahmadiyya is known as a peace-loving and peaceful organisation on both local and national levels, whose motto is, love for all, hatred for none. Each year, Jamaat Ahmadiyya Australia celebrates Australia Day with great enthusiasm and excitement. These activities not only make Jamaat Ahmadiyya stand out among others, but also help it to convey the true teachings of Islam and the Quran to the rest of Australians. These humble efforts of the Jamaat are recognised and appreciated at different levels, from media, from politicians, from charity organisations, and from the general public. And as a result, introduction of Ahmadiyyat is extending to the wider public. In 2012, Jamaat Ahmadiyya's Jalsa Salana was awarded as the best community event of the year in local council. Due to Jamaat Ahmadiyya Australia, Nizam-e-Jamaat has been firmly established in neighbouring islands such as Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and New Caledonia. In short, Ahmadiyya is progressing by leaps and bounds across the world as per the promise of Allah Almighty to His promised Messiah and Mahdi of that age.